Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The Snake Pit. I'm your host, Son of Bat, and tonight we're going to take a dive into the depraved history of snuff films. So buckle up because shit's about to go dark. I assume the main question you're all wondering is why snuff films? Well, I guess to properly answer that, it has to be broken up into two portions to make sense. The first being that a few months ago I started dabbling in true crime videos as a way to add more different but dark content to the channel. The videos I ended up making were the Columbine iceberg and the V-Tech iceberg. Both came out better than I'd expected, so I figured you guys must want more of this type of content. This resulted in me going back to the drawing board to find the next disturbing topic to cover. Originally, I was going to do another iceberg video, but when it came time to make the chart, I kind of got bong fog on the brain and ultimately couldn't settle on a single case or idea. Some options I had floating around were the Manson family iceberg and the serial killer conspiracy iceberg. For the former, I'd have to reread Chaos, Helter Skelter, The Family, and Manson in his own words, and for the latter, I'd have to reread Program to Kill, The Ultimate Evil, and the Encyclopedia of Satanic Crimes, just to name a few. And to be honest, it got a little overwhelming. Not to make excuses or say that those videos won't happen sometime in the future, I just don't want to rush the video for the sake of content. Basically how it boils down is when it comes to this kind of like true crime shit, I basically just want to get all the information I can and make the icebergs or charts the best they can be for you guys without leaving anything, off the table, so to speak. So finally, after all this, I realized the best way to get back into true crime videos was to really laser in on one specific crime or incident rather than a whole list or chart. That's basically how I landed on snuff films. This is one topic that has spread its tentacles into a number of other crime cases and conspiracy theories since the 1970s and has only gotten more fucked up and depraved with the passage of time and ever-growing spread of the internet. The other reason why I feel like this topic would fit the channel so well is because of the amount of horror and crime media it's inspired over time, like movies, video games, novels, and comics, a few of which I'll be listing later in the video for you sick fucks to check out. So I guess the best way to start this video is to break down what a snuff film is and then descend into the hellish history surrounding them. So, like I said, warning, shit's gonna get really fucked up. From the start, we have multiple definitions about what a snuff film is, and one major contradiction. The most basic definition is that a snuff film is a movie depicting a real murder on camera. Some definitions include people committing suicide on camera, or that snuff films can be pornographic and are made for financial gain, usually rumored to be circulated amongst the pervert elite for high prices. The Collins English Dictionary defines a snuff movie as a pornographic film in which an unsuspecting actress or actor is murdered at the climax of the film. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it more broadly as a violent film that shows a real murder. And lastly, for my horror magazine collectors, Fangoria defines snuff movies as films in which a person is killed on camera, the death is premeditated with the purpose of being filmed in order to make money. Oftentimes, there is a sexual aspect to the murder, either on film as in a porn scene that ends horribly, or that the final project is used for sexual gratification. Films featuring death that are authentic but accidental are not considered snuff because the deaths were not planned. Other death on video, such as terrorists beheading victims, are done to fulfill an ideology and not to earn money. Then comes the contradiction, in my opinion. Despite multiple definitions and alleged cases through the decades, both media, law enforcement, and apparently the general population see this as an urban legend or even worse, a conspiracy. The first time the term snuff film entered the public lexicon was in 1971 with Ed Saunders' book, The Family, the story of Charles Manson's Dune Buggy Attack Battalion. While researching and writing the book, Ed claims he was contacted by an anonymous one-time member of the family who told him that, quote, Charlie and other members of the cult stole NBC film equipment and used it to record some of the murders. Some of these films are rumored to be an axe murder and the ritual killing of a woman. Allegedly, these films were buried in the California desert and as a result have never been found. Along with this claim, there was a whole chapter about the Process Church of the Final Judgment and their connection to Manson. The process, in and of itself, has numerous ties to serial killers and snuff stories, so seeing them brought up is really no surprise. What gets really weird, though, is that in 2002, the book was re-released with all references of the process removed and any mention of snuff films being severely downplayed, almost relegating it back to the realm of urban legend. Manson wasn't the only degenerate who allegedly dabbled in snuff films. Apparently, there's a whole list of killers, cults, and production companies who have helped contribute to the clandestine snuff market. Another killer with ties to this market, and conveniently enough the process and its offshoot 4Pi, is David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. Sometime after his incarceration, Berkowitz warned a fellow inmate about the impending murder of Ronald Sisman and his girlfriend Elizabeth Platzman on October 31st, 1981. According to the prison informant, Berkowitz claimed that Sisman possessed video footage of the Son of Sam's final murder of Stacy Moskowitz in 1977 and planned to turn it over to the authorities. Berkowitz alleged that a satanic cult, which he claimed was responsible for some of the Son of Sam crimes and the Sisman murders, ordered the hit to recover the incriminating evidence. And sure enough, on October 31st, 1981, Ronald Sisman and his girlfriend were found murdered in their Manhattan apartment in what looked like a robbery. However, even though the apartment was torn up, no items seemed to be reported missing. The many claims made by Berkowitz about a satanic cult orchestrating the Son of Sam murders were investigated and compiled into a giant volume by author Maury Terry, called The Ultimate Evil. This book also alleges that fat fuck film producer Roy Radin and his degenerate photographer friend Robert Mapplethorpe had a hand in financing these films. And sure enough, while the book was being compiled, Roy Radin was found with his head blasted off in a fucking ditch. Of all the loony bullshit in the satanic panic of the 80s, genuine stories like these were often overlooked by the total circus of it all. And really, it's a shame because now you can't have these conversations without someone calling you a religious zealot or a conspiracy theorist. I mean, still to this day, if you look at anything with the satanic panic, the mass majority of people will downplay it and just say it was all bullshit. It's really fucked up. While I do agree there was a lot of bullshit in the satanic panic, I do believe a lot of genuine cases of murder and exploitation have been overlooked, due to the shit like Pokemon, heavy metal, horror movies, and all that stuff. But anyway, however, what many people may not know is shortly after the release and traction of this book, David Berkowitz was attacked and had his throat slit behind bars. After this, he never spoke again about the process, 4Pi, or Snuff Films, for fear that members of the cult would murder his father on the outside. Another serial killer alleged to have ties with the Snuff Network is the killer clown John Wayne Gacy. It is widely known by true crime buffs that Gacy was a master manipulator, liar, and general sick piece of shit. It is also known that since the day of his capture in 1978, up until the day he died, he claimed his innocence, claimed he was railroaded, and claimed that there were other parties involved. In the 2021 documentary Devil in Disguise, two names that came up as highly suspicious and possible accomplices in Gacy's crimes were his former employees Michael Rossi and David Cram, due to the fact that they had keys to his house and were even both roommates at a time. On the surface, this sounds unbelievable and contradictory to the official narrative. However, it is not that strange considering Gacy modeled his sadistic killings off the Houston mass murders that happened in 1973, even keeping news clippings and using the same torture methods and tricks that Dean Kroll, the Candyman, used. In those murders, Dean Kroll used teenage accomplices David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley to lure in local boys with the promise of parties or drugs. They were then captured, tortured, raped, killed, and then finally buried under a boat shed that Dean owned. From the handcuff trick to the torture board, it all lined up with what Gacy would go on to do to the young men of Chicago in the late 70s. A common threat that Dean used to keep his accomplices in line was that he had links to a boy trafficking ring in Houston made up of elite pedophiles that he was sending material and victims to. These kinds of threats and accusations will come up later with Gacy. At the time of his arrest, several ex-Gacy employees were looked at as possible suspects or accomplices. The reason why David Cram and Michael Rossi were pursued more than others was because of several key factors. One of them I call crawlspace activity. And what I mean by this is that Gacy had both Cram and Rossi repeatedly dig trenches in the crawlspace under his house, ostensibly for plumbing reasons and to spread lime there. The smell of decomposition was reportedly so strong and noticeable that many found it hard to believe that both Rossi and Cram didn't question it more. The second would be victims' belongings. Rossi had bought a car from Gacy that had belonged to one of the victims and had forged the transfer forms. Cram was also given a watch by Gacy who said he, quote, got it from a dead person. The third is incriminating statements. Police surveillance once overheard Rossi ask Gacy, quote, "And what? Buried like the other five?" End quote. 4. Victim connection. Rossi was the link between Gacy and victim John Mowry, having allegedly urged Mowry to meet Gacy for a job. And finally, 5. Testimony. Both testified at Gacy's trial, with Cram's testimony reportedly conflicting with his earlier confession to investigators on certain points, such as a sexual relationship with Gacy. Both had also been victims of Gacy's sexual assaults. Now, knowing what we know about Gacy and his obsession with the Candyman case, it's fair to assume that David Cram and Michael Rossi most likely could have filled out a similar role to that of David Brooks or Elmer Wayne Henley. But the most damning connection of all was David Cram's friend and fellow Gacy employee Philip Paskey. This piece of shit also had a set of keys to Gacy's home and was also frequently seen there. Before working for PDM contractors, he was the right-hand man to serial pedophile and pornographer John David Norman. This fuck could have had a whole deep dive and fucking chart in and of itself, but we'd be here for fucking hours. Some important things, though, that we do need to note about John David Norman are that he wasn't just some pervert in a white van. This freak was on an Epstein level with his trafficking operation and even infiltrating the Boy Scouts among other groups. The sick fuck also had a private island just like Jeffrey called North Fox Island, where he and accomplices committed unspeakable acts on children. While in prison, he started a pedophile porn network named the Delta Project that stemmed from his previous group called the Odyssey Foundation. To make this disgusting story even more unsettling, John David Norman lived close by to Dean Kroll around the time of the Candyman murders, and then he moved when the killings stopped. Then he ended up living close by to Gacy during his murder spree. It should also be noted that Gacy implicated Paskey, Norman, and 2 other PDM employees as accomplices in the murders. He has described Paskey as dangerous and is quoted in saying he, quote, pimped girls and boys for sex or movies. In a 1992 interview, Gacy claimed Norman and the Delta Project were producing snuff films of young boys, possibly including some of Gacy's victims. In the 2021 documentary I'd mentioned earlier called The Devil in Disguise, we get some pretty shocking information throughout, but by episode 5 and 6 we get hit with bombshells about a man named Norman and the Delta Project. But the details remain vague, and they always assert that Gacy knew something was going on, but that didn't know the specifics or details. We even get an interview with Gacy's former death penalty attorney, Karen Conti, who is quoted as saying, "He always said he didn't kill all the boys," and Gacy alluded to the idea that there could have been other people who were interested in killing these boys. He alluded to the idea that there may have been a snuff film operation and that some of these young men and boys were being killed and videotaped, and that the videos were being sold on the black market. He alluded to that. He also didn't give any names. He didn't say he was involved. He didn't tell me who was involved, but he alluded to that, end quote. She also says that it would make total sense for Gacy to be connected to a snuff ring, considering his obsession with porn and making money. But in 2020, a podcast called The Clown and the Candyman, and later in 2021, a documentary of the same name, we get some solid confirmation on Gacy's connection to Norman and Paskey, because we get to hear the 1992 tapes where it's clear that John Wayne Gacy knew all these people. We hear him literally say it. We literally hear him say it himself, and honestly, after all this digging, it's pretty fucking terrifying. It's also the only documentary I've seen that points out the clear connection and obsession Gacy had with Kroll's crimes. When it comes to the conspiracy of an international snuff market, many serial killers and even a few production companies have been named or implicated. It usually results in making these horrendous videos and selling them either on the black market, dark web, or to elites paying a high price. Some of the other killers alleged to be involved in this network are Fred and Rose West, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, Robert Pickton, the Toolbox Killers, the Toy Box Killer, and the Den Prostrovic Maniacs. Kinda don't really want to apologize for saying that wrong, because those 3 pricks are pieces of shit. Serial killers weren't the only crime cases to have allegations in the world of snuff. In 1988, when the Franklin cover-up broke and made waves across America, one of the most shocking stories came from a former victim, Paul Benassi. He spoke of a network made up of powerful elite who paid for the shipping, torture, and murder of young boys, going all the way up to the White House. One claim he made was that he was taken to the Bohemian Grove, sexually assaulted, and then forced to do the same on a younger boy who was then later shot in the head. all of which was said to have been filmed by a man named Thompson, later alleged to be Hunter S. Thompson. Now, before you jump ship and call me crazy, the thing I find interesting about this, other than the adrenochrome segment from Fear and Loathing and the fucked up writings in Hey Rube, is that this isn't the only allegation I've come across about Hunter S. Thompson and his apparent ties or addiction to snuff films. After his death in 2005, a postcard written by his editorial assistant Nicole Brown titled, "In Memory of Hunter S. Thompson, postcard from Louisville, Kentucky," she is quoted as saying, "Despite the rumors that followed me home when I left, he never held a gun to my head or laid a finger on me. But that's not to say he didn't throw a tantrum or two. Paranoid, he would lock everyone out of his cabin for hours at a time, intermittently setting off his alarm and firing guns into the air. One time I watched him beat his car because cigarettes were locked inside, and another time he threw me out of the house for refusing to watch a snuff film." Adding more layers of gonzo confusion to these sick claims, the same letter goes on to explain that when Hunter felt he wasn't getting enough attention from Nicole, he would force his pet kitten's face into a pile of cocaine, then push it across the room. I don't want to 100% say his ties to the Snuff Network are true because we only have a few claims and rumors to go on, but based off his shitty behavior that's been documented many times and his tendency to blend fact with fiction, it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Hunter S. Thompson was involved in this sick and disgusting shit. Another celebrity piece of shit alleged to have been addicted to degrading porn, including snuff films, was Corey Feldman's idol, Hugh Hefner. Allegations surrounding the topic stem from the 2022 A&E docuseries Secrets of Playboy, in which former Hefner live-in girlfriend Sandra Theodore claimed Hefner suggested they, quote, watch snuff films together to get aroused. She stated she declined and was horrified by the suggestion, which contributed to her view of him as a, quote, monster. I recommend you guys check out this documentary as it sheds a bunch of light on the sick and twisted stories from the Playboy Mansion. Aside from the snuff story, the worst one I think I've ever heard came from former Playmate PJ Maston. She said she watched Hefner force the actress Linda Lovelace to practice fellatio on a German Shepherd. Again, these are stories that can be found surprisingly easily with a quick search on Google, yet no one seems to care enough to dig, look, or do anything about it. With the rise and expansion of the internet and later creation of digital currency, like Bitcoin, came a new breed of horror and exploitation. Of course, I'm talking about online snuff. To me, this encapsulates a wide range of topics and subject matter. The first one that comes to mind is gore sites. Now, back in the 2000s, if you were fucked up like me and horror movies weren't extreme enough for you, or let's say you wanted to see uncensored footage of the war in Afghanistan, chances were you signed onto the many gore sites populating the internet. These sites offered up 100% real videos and pictures of some of the most horrendous deaths I and many others of my generation have seen. For a time, there were several sites active with names like bestgore.com, orgrish.com, which later rebranded and became liveleak.com, and of course goregrish.com. Some of the things you could see on these sites were cartel and later ISIS executions, usually beheadings, which technically, like I said, aren't considered snuff because these videos are used for propaganda purposes or to strike fear or intimidation into their enemies. However, with this definition, I disagree because one of the three definitions earlier clearly stated that snuff films simply are death captured on film. So, to some degree, I would consider cartel and terrorist videos, the many murder videos from Eastern Europe and Brazil, and the unfortunate amount of suicide videos from around the world as a form of snuff. The one thing I remember was that was very popular back in the day was the Mexican chainsaw beheading, where these two dudes who wronged the cartel in some way were tied up and had their heads cut off with a chainsaw while they were still alive. And I'm sure you guys still remember that one. Other topics that were shown on these sites were things like vehicle accidents, uncut war footage, and even murders. And if it couldn't get any more depraved, of course there was also a sexual element to some of these sites. And what I mean by that is a few of these sites had literally only pornography advertisements and topics ranging from necrophilia, genital mutilation, and even rape. Of course, it didn't take long for these sites to get shut down, and rightfully so, but not before they left some irreversible damage and trauma on the world. Gore sites were usually found on the surface web with a quick Google search, but the real darkness, as many have claimed, lays in the dark web. There, with digital currency or one wrong click, you can find yourself deep into the black pit of red rooms and sexual exploitation videos. Videos of women and children being murdered and tortured for a high price, and a circle of the most vile and disgusting pieces of shit to walk the planet. Some have claimed that red rooms are nothing more than a modern spin on the snuff tape conspiracy, and that any claims about this shouldn't be taken seriously. However, with how fucked up human beings have proven themselves to be time and time again, and the exposure of animals like Peter Scully in his video Daisy's Destruction, I don't think this is at all out of the realm of possibility. In fact, it's an unfortunate reality. Other extreme sites I thought I'd mention, although they didn't contain snuff, were Necrobabes, a site that posted pictures of female models pretending to be dead, labeled as erotic horror for adults, and of course the Cannibal Cafe, a site where people posted their cannibalistic fantasies and desires. It was through this site a German man named Armin Meiwes had found a voluntary victim in Bernard Brandes, whom had consented in being murdered and cannibalized, all while being filmed. After Meiwes and Brandes jointly attempted to eat Brandes' severed penis, Meiwes murdered him and then proceeded to eat a large amount of his flesh. He was then arrested in December 2002. In January 2004, Meiwes was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years and 6 months in prison. In a retrial on May 2006, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Earlier, when I was talking about serial killers, I mentioned how a lot of these theories and cases mention them being a part of a snuff industry or production company, but so far no company name has surfaced. However, in recent years that may have changed. What I mean by this is that there's an alleged snuff production company that operates in Arizona called Midnight Productions. From what I've heard, this group is well known through the homeless community and is a common fear because it involves the cartel, specifically Mexican mafia, and the local police taking homeless people, mostly women, and using them as sex slaves or making snuff films with them. Another story I've heard about Midnight Productions is that they used to go by Tiny Dancer Productions, and that they also may be to blame for the death of porn star Angela Devi in Scottsdale. All of this is very fucked up and a very depressing rabbit hole I recommend you guys look into because there's a lot of entries and stories from Arizona locals about this. Another category of snuff that people don't often consider is photography. I remember a couple years ago I was watching videos on Lowfield and Love's channel, Now the Deliberate Stranger, about Program to Kill, and he had this video about Dahmer where a cop involved in the case was talking about the photos that came out from the crime scene, and how to have those photos uncensored in a book, one would have to have taken them illegally from the original police report and files. So in a way, these photos are snuff because the author is making a profit off the quote gory details. It would also explain why newer editions of these books or newer books about these cases don't contain photos. We also have to take into account that the killers who took these photos did so with the intent of some form of gratification, most likely sexual. While these photos don't directly capture the moment of death, they are usually taken right before or just after the act itself. So maybe it's splitting hairs, but I would consider these snuff because they're serving basically the same function as the snuff films. Some killers known to have taken photos of their victims in various poses or states of decomposition were both Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Then we have Bob Berdella, who took pictures of his victims while he was torturing them, capturing their twisted expressions of pain forever. These same images of extreme torture were later used in the book about his case called Rites of Burial. Okay, wow, we covered a lot of ground today, and the research involved has honestly made my brain feel like it's half melted. So at least now we can get to, like, the fun part, or I guess you would say the light part of the video. Of course, I'm talking about horror and thriller films based on the concept of snuff films. This is a plot device that has been used several times since the term was coined in the 70s, and has definitely become a staple in the horror genre. Right now, I'm going to give you guys a quick list of movies about or containing snuff films that I think will be worth your time. These movies will range from exploitation flicks to serious nail-biting thrillers, so expect the quality to be kind of all over the place. This is in no way a definitive or complete list, just my personal opinion and picks. Starting off the list, we have 8mm, followed by Hardcore from 1979, Cannibal Holocaust, Serbian Film, The Poughkeepsie Tapes, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, Videodrome, Emmanuel in America, of course the August Underground Trilogy, Man Bites Dog, The Evil Dead Trap, Vacancy, Thesis from 1996, Visitor Q, Guinea Pig Devil's Experiment, Guinea Pig Part 2, Flowers of Flesh and Blood. And funny enough, in 1991, coked out piece of shit Charlie Sheen rented this movie, got so scared that he thought it was a real snuff film, he ended up calling the FBI to come and investigate it, and then they had to tell him it was just a movie. Always thought that was a pretty fun little piece of trivia that I just had to throw in there. Then we have American Guinea Pig, Bouquet of Guts and Gore, Special Effects from 1984, Snuff from 1975, The Hills Run Red, Atroz, Video Violence, and The Last House on Dead End Street. Now, those aren't everything, just some of what I consider the best or more memorable. If there's any movies about this fuck subject that I may have missed that you guys think are great, comment it down below, and who knows, maybe I'll cover it in the future. And while not directly snuff related, I couldn't help but mention some shockumentaries. Now, shockumentaries, for those you don't know, are pretty self-explanatory, but basically they're just shocking documentaries that often depict taboo subjects, usually death, and most of the time the footage is 100% real. Unless your series is called Faces of Death, where it's a 50-50 of real and fake footage. But anyway, here's a list of some fucked up shockumentaries you guys might find interesting. Of course, there's the original Faces of Death series I mentioned, but as time has gone on, it's aged pretty poorly, and it's, widely known that a good bulk of the footage is staged or faked. However, it remains a classic of extreme cinema and horror history, so I think it's worth a mention in putting on this list. There's a 4-disc set that comes with the whole Faces of Death franchise. I recommend getting it, particularly due to the fact that the later movies are a little bit better. I personally like the second one. I believe that's the one with sport injuries and road injuries, but yeah, the sequels are definitely better than the original movie. But if 100% real is what you want, then I'd have to recommend the 5-part documentary series Traces of Death. Some of the content included in this series are scenes of murder, such as the murder of Marcia Martin Munoz, suicides like Bud Dwyer, fatal accidents, war atrocities, and medical procedures. The footage is often presented with a sparse sensationalist voiceover and background music from death metal and grindcore bands, particularly from the second film onwards. My personal favorite in the Traces of Death series would have to be Part 3 because the soundtrack slaps so fucking hard in contrast with the barrage of fucked up images that come on the screen. Lastly, if you want something controversial and shocking but also thought-provoking, I'd recommend you guys check out The Killing of America. This shockumentary was filmed in 1981 but wasn't released in America until 2021 due to its depiction of uncensored death and violence. This documentary focuses on how America is single-handedly becoming the #1 killing ground in the world. It is very shocking when you contrast these statistics from the 80s to now and see how it's gotten 1,000 times worse since then. Lastly, I would also recommend Season 2, Episode 4 of the 2006 series titled The Dark Side of Porn. It's a pretty good series overall, but this episode in particular is about the debate of snuff films being real or just a myth. Of course, film isn't the only medium that's touched on this grisly subject matter. In my opinion, one of the greatest horror games of all time is based on snuff films. And obviously, I'm talking about Manhunt. This is by far Rockstar's most controversial game. Set within the 3D Grand Theft Auto universe, this game is about a death row inmate whose death is faked. When he wakes up, he finds himself in a shithole called Carcer City, where he has to participate in a series of snuff films to save himself and his family. But instead of killing innocent people, it's gangs of psychos, and each group is more fucked up than the last. There's a lot I want to say about this game, but I can't because I plan to do a video on it one day in the future, and it's very underrated and overhated sequel. But trust me when I say it is a fucking classic, bud. Another game that uses snuff films as a plot point is the newly released Butcher's Creek on Steam. This game is pretty much like Condemned Criminal Origins with its brutal FPS combat. I also recommend that game to any of my PC players out there because it goes for a great price and is super addicting. And lastly, while this game, not directly tied to snuff or about snuff, it definitely borrows that VHS murder or live leak aesthetic. Of course, I'm talking about Kane and Lynch 2 Dog Days. This game is super divisive, but honestly, I get a lot of fun out of it. It's got a lot of guns, a lot of chaos, and a lot of action. It also looks fucking disgusting, with some, it looks like first-person, shaky cam footage. It's also just really great to fun to play with a friend on co-op. In this game, the whole aesthetic is like I said, CCTV or live leak footage. It makes the game feel dirty. It makes it feel realistic. Well, as realistic as an over-the-top action game can get. Where the snuff angle really comes into play, though, is when you or enemies kill civilians in shootouts. If a civilian is killed, their face will blur out and pixelate like we're watching it on an old TV. That contrast with the neon and chaotic streets of Hong Kong is really cool and kind of nauseating, and it makes this game stand out from the very, very gray and, in my opinion, flat first game. Definitely worth a play, and as a plus, if you have a 360 or a PS3, this game goes for super, super cheap and usually shows up in pretty much every game store I've ever come across. Hey, I said it was fun, but I didn't say it was great. And lastly, to finish off this video completely, I'm going to mention some books and comics that mention snuff films. Like the movie list I gave you guys, this is going to be kind of all over the place, but to avoid confusion, I'll split it into two categories, nonfiction and fiction. For nonfiction, we have The Family by Ed Saunders, The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry, The Franklin Cover-Up by John DeCamp, Why Johnny Can't Come Home by Noreen Gosh, Raising Hell, an encyclopedia of devil worship and satanic crime by Michael Newton, Program to Kill by Dave McGowan, Killing for Culture, Death Film from Mondo to Snuff by David Kierkes and David Slater, Snuff, Real Death in Screen Media by Neil Jackson, and for fiction we have The Pig and its sequel, The House by Edward Lee, What Comes Next by John Katzenbach, Bangkok Haunts by John Burdett, Snuff by Chuck Palahniuk, Survivor by J.F. Gonzalez, Running Dog by Don DeLeo, and as an honorable mention, I'm going to throw in Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis because there's a really, really nasty part about a snuff film in that book. Obviously doesn't show up in the movie though. And lastly, we're going to finish off with a graphic novel series. This one's called Red Room by Ed Piskor. This is a 3-part graphic novel and is all about the online world of snuff and red rooms. It's brutal, vicious, and has some hilarious dark humor. I highly recommend it to underground comics or horror comic fans alike. Part 1 is called Red Room, Part 2 is called Red Room Trigger Warnings, and lastly, Part 3 is called Red Room Crypto Killers. Hopefully one day in the future I will review this series because, like I said before, it is fucking hardcore. Well, that about completes it for my history of snuff video. I hope you guys like this and found it informative, but honestly, after all this digging and research, I feel fucking disgusting, and I think I'm going to have to take a shower and then smoke my brain in outer space to forget about it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one, guys. Peace!